Hey everyone! Just a quick reminder to subscribe and hit that like button if you're enjoying my stories. It really helps me know you're into the content. Thanks for tuning in, and let's dive right in. Working late at subway stations wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Most nights were uneventful. Just me, my cleaning supplies, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights in the otherwise empty stations. I'd gotten used to the solitude, though there were moments, especially in the quieter, dimly lit places, when the silence felt more alive than comforting. Still, routine was routine, and I liked to think I could handle anything. That night started the same as any other. I was stationed at Hyde Park Corner, methodically scrubbing graffiti off the walls and sweeping up litter. The familiar rhythm of my work was interrupted when my phone buzzed. I wiped my hands on my uniform and answered, seeing my boss's name flash on the screen. "Susan," he began, his tone brisk like he was ticking a task off a list. "I need you to cover Down Street Station tonight." I paused, confused. Down Street? I didn't think that station was even in use anymore. "It's not," he replied, "but it still needs cleaning. A big shot client's touring the area tomorrow for some redevelopment plans. It's last minute, but I need you to handle it." I opened my mouth to protest. I'd never even been to Down Street Station, and the idea of cleaning an abandoned place at night wasn't exactly appealing, but he cut me off. "No arguments, Susan. You're the closest, and I need this done tonight. Think of the overtime." Before I could respond, he hung up. I stared at my phone, the unease already creeping in. When I returned to the break room to grab a drink, I mentioned the assignment to my coworkers. Sandra, who was halfway through her sandwich, froze mid-bite. Joe, leaning against the counter with a coffee, let out a low whistle. "Down Street?" Joe asked, setting his cup down. "You're kidding, right?" "Nope. Apparently I'm supposed to clean it tonight. Why? What's the big deal?" Sandra exchanged a wary glance with Joe, then leaned forward. "It's not just abandoned," she said. "That place, it's weird. You know the stories, right?" I frowned. "What stories?" Joe shook his head, like he didn't even want to talk about it. But Sandra wasn't so hesitant. "People talk about strange stuff happening there. You're not just cleaning a station, Susan, you're dealing with them." "Them?" I repeated, half laughing. "Come on, guys, it's just an old station." Sandra ignored my skepticism. "There are rules you have to follow when you're there," she said, her voice dropping. "And I mean it, Susan. Follow them. Word for word. Or you might not make it out." I rolled my eyes. "Let me guess, you're going to tell me it's haunted?" "Not haunted," Sandra corrected. "Worse." She grabbed a napkin and scribbled something down, handing it to me. It was a list of 5 rules, written in her hurried scrawl. "If you see the street musician playing buckets, don't tip him. No matter what he says. If the woman in the fur coat asks for directions, tell her how to get to the nearest mental hospital. If the bracelet seller talks to you, don't ignore him. Let him lead the conversation, and don't walk away until he ends it. There are 2 others. You'll know them when you see them. Follow their rules, or you'll regret it." "This is ridiculous," I said, folding the napkin. Joe, who'd been silent until now, finally spoke. "She's right, though. Don't treat this like a joke, Susan. Down Street isn't like the other stations. And those people? They're not like the ones you see every day. They're different." I laughed, trying to brush off the chill creeping up my spine. "You 2 have been watching too many horror movies." But as I stuffed the napkin into my pocket, I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't joking. By the time my shift ended at Hyde Park Corner, I was still rolling my eyes at the absurdity of it all. Rules, mysterious strangers, a cursed station. Please. It was just another cleaning job. At least that's what I told myself as I made my way to Down Street Station. When I arrived at Down Street Station, the first thing that struck me was the silence. Most stations, even the quiet ones, hum with a faint sense of life. A train rumbling in the distance, the occasional footsteps of a late-night commuter. Not here. The air was still, heavy, and oppressively quiet. The entrance looked like it hadn't seen human activity in decades. The faded sign above the door barely spelled out Down Street, and the cracked tiles on the walls seemed ready to crumble at the slightest touch. I hesitated at the gate, gripping my cleaning supplies tighter, and told myself it was just another station. Nothing special, nothing scary. As I descended the stairs, a damp, musty smell hit me. The air felt cooler, almost clammy, and my footsteps echoed loudly in the stairwell. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into the past, a neglected corner of the city no one cared to remember. At the bottom of the stairs, something caught my eye. Pinned to a rusted bulletin board by the entrance to the platform was a tattered, yellowed piece of paper. I stepped closer, and my stomach sank when I realized what it was: the rules. The handwriting was shaky and uneven, like it had been scrawled in a hurry. If you see the street musician playing buckets, don't tip him, no matter what he says. If the woman in the fur coat asks for directions, tell her how to get to the nearest mental hospital. If the bracelet seller talks to you, don't ignore him. Let him lead the conversation, and don't walk away until he ends it. There are two others. You'll know them when you see them. Follow their rules or else. Underneath the list, someone had scribbled in bold, uneven letters, "Follow them or else." I let out a shaky laugh, though it didn't sound convincing, even to me. This had to be a joke. A prank from my coworkers, maybe. They'd gone to a lot of effort to spook me. Still, I couldn't help but glance around, suddenly hyper-aware of the silence pressing in on me. I shoved the list into my pocket, telling myself I didn't need it. It's just a stupid piece of paper, I thought. But my hands were clammy as I grabbed my mop and bucket and started down the platform. The station was even worse than I'd imagined. Cracks snaked through the floor tiles, some loose enough to shift under my feet. The lights overhead flickered erratically, buzzing faintly before plunging sections of the platform into brief darkness. Shadows danced in the corners, distorted by the unreliable light. I was halfway through scrubbing a section of the wall when I heard it. The sharp, rhythmic beats of plastic buckets. I froze, gripping my mop tightly. The sound was distant but distinct, echoing down the empty station. It wasn't the kind of rhythm you'd expect from an amateur. It was fast, deliberate, almost hypnotic. I turned toward the sound, my heart thudding in time with the beats. At the far end of the platform, partially obscured by shadows, I saw him. The street musician. He sat cross-legged on the ground, surrounded by a haphazard array of overturned buckets in varying sizes. His hands moved so quickly across them it was hard to follow, creating a chaotic but oddly precise rhythm. His head was down, obscuring his face, but I could hear him muttering under his breath. I took a step back, trying to steady my breathing. The rule flashed in my mind: don't tip him. No matter what. The musician suddenly stopped playing, his head snapping up as if he'd heard my thoughts. His face was gaunt, pale, and stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. His eyes locked onto mine, wide and bloodshot, and his mouth twisted into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Spare some change for the music?" he called out. His voice sharp and raspy. I shook my head, trying to appear calm. "I don't have any cash," I said quickly, which was technically true. His grin widened, and he slammed his hands down on the buckets, resuming his frantic rhythm. The noise was louder now, the beats almost aggressive. "Don't lie to me," he shouted, his voice cutting through the station like a blade. "I know you've got something. Everyone's got something." I backed away, clutching my mop like it was a shield. My pulse was racing, but I forced myself to remember the rule. No tipping. No matter what. "I can't," I said firmly, keeping my voice as steady as I could. He stopped playing again, the sudden silence almost more jarring than the noise. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, his grin slowly fading into a scowl. "Fine," he muttered, turning back to his buckets. "Suit yourself." I didn't wait for him to start playing again. I turned and hurried toward the next section of the platform, my footsteps echoing loudly. The tension in my chest didn't ease as I moved farther from the musician. In fact, it grew worse. The station was silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the musician following me. But the platform was empty, save for the flickering lights and the long, stretching shadows. Trying to shake the unease, I forced myself to focus on my work. I wasn't gonna let some creepy street performer get in my head. But as I scrubbed a patch of grime off the floor, I couldn't help but notice that my hands were still trembling. The silence after the street musician was worse than his shouting. Every creak of the station, every distant drip of water, felt amplified. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I forced myself to keep working. It was either that, or let the unease swallow me whole. The air near the stairwell felt colder, the dampness more pronounced. I focused on scrubbing a stubborn stain on the tile. the rhythmic motion of the brush keeping my thoughts steady. That's when I heard it. A faint tapping sound, like high heels on tile. I froze, my grip tightening on the brush. The tapping grew louder, deliberate, until I saw her. She came down the stairs slowly, her silhouette sharp against the dim, flickering light. A woman, tall and elegant, in a sleek black fur coat that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Large sunglasses covered her eyes, even though we were underground, and her red lips were set in a faint smile. Everything about her screamed wealth and sophistication, but something about her presence made my skin crawl. "Excuse me," she said, her voice smooth and polished. "Can you help me? I'm looking for an address." She held out a piece of paper, but I didn't take it. Instead, I glanced at it, and my heart sank. The address wasn't real. I knew the streets in this area, and this one didn't exist. The rule flashed in my mind: always tell her how to get to the nearest mental hospital. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. "Of course," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "You'll want to head to Bethlehem Royal Hospital. It's not far from here." Her smile widened, revealing teeth that were just a little too white, a little too sharp. "Bethlehem Royal," she repeated slowly, as if savoring the words. "Interesting choice. How do I get there?" I resisted the urge to back away, my hands clenching at my sides. "Take the Central Line northbound, and then transfer at Liverpool Street. It's only a short walk from there." She tilted her head, her smile never faltering. For a moment I thought she might say something else, but instead she nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice dripping with amusement. Without another word, she turned and walked down the corridor, her heels clicking against the tiles. I watched her go, my heart pounding in my chest. She didn't look back, but something about the way she moved, graceful yet unnatural, made my stomach twist. When she finally disappeared around a corner, I let out a shaky breath, my hands trembling. "This can't be real," I muttered to myself. But deep down, I knew it was. I forced myself to keep going, though my nerves were frayed. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound made me jump. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't stop replaying the woman's sharp smile in my head. As I moved deeper into the station, I spotted another figure approaching from the other end of the platform. My stomach churned. It was a man this time, carrying a large, worn backpack that seemed to weigh him down. His clothes were rugged, his hair wild, and his eyes darted around like he was searching for something, or someone. When he spotted me, his face lit up in an almost predatory grin. "Hey there!" he called out, his voice cheerful but unnervingly loud in the quiet station. "You look like someone who could use a little luck." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a handful of colorful braided bracelets. "Handmade," he said, holding them out to me. "Each one tells a story. Stories of adventure, of journeys across the world. Interested?" My first instinct was to walk away, but the rules stopped me. Don't ignore him. Let him lead the conversation. "They're nice," I said cautiously. "Nice?" he repeated, his grin faltering slightly. "These bracelets have been to places you can't even imagine. The mountains of Peru, the deserts of Morocco, the jungles of Thailand, and you think they're just nice?" I opened my mouth to respond, but he didn't let me. "You know, people like you," he continued, his tone shifting to something sharper. "You don't appreciate life's adventures. Always stuck in your little routines, afraid to step out of your comfort zone." I felt my cheeks flush, but I didn't dare argue. He stared at me, his grin returning but colder this time. "Tell me, have you ever traveled, seen the world, or are you one of those people who's just waiting for life to happen to them?" I haven't traveled much," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. "Figures," he said, "but maybe one day you'll change that. Maybe one day you'll take a chance." He stared at me for a long moment, then abruptly shoved the bracelets back into his bag. "Well, I won't waste any more of your time," he said, his tone suddenly light again. "Good luck, Susan." I froze. "How do you know my name?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. He just turned and walked away, whistling a strange, tuneless melody as he disappeared into the shadows. By the time he was gone, I was shaking. My breaths came in short, shallow gasps, and my hands felt ice cold. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a joke. The rules were real, and so were they. I didn't know how much time had passed since I first arrived at Downstreet Station, but it felt like an eternity. The cold air had seeped into my bones, and the silence felt heavier with each passing minute. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the fur coat and the bracelet seller. Their presence lingered in the station like a faint echo, even though they were long gone. I tried to focus on my work, scrubbing a section of the grimy wall near the edge of the platform. The repetitive motion of cleaning usually calmed me, but tonight, every sound set my nerves on edge. That's when I saw him. At the far end of the platform, barely illuminated by the flickering overhead lights, an old man sat slumped on a bench. His shoulders were hunched, and his head hung low as if the weight of the world rested on him. I froze. He hadn't been there a moment ago. I didn't need to look at the list in my pocket to know who he was. The old man on the bench. My coworkers hadn't given me any hints about what made him dangerous, only that I was never to interrupt or acknowledge him. Taking a shaky breath, I turned my gaze away and focused on the patch of grime in front of me. My hands moved mechanically as I scrubbed, but my ears were locked onto the faint murmurs drifting from the man's direction. "She's always watching," he muttered, his voice hoarse and uneven. "Even now, even here." My stomach twisted, but I didn't look at him. The muttering grew louder, the words tumbling out faster. "They think they can hide from her, but they can't. No one can. No one." I kept my head down, pretending I couldn't hear him. My hands shook as I gripped the mop, scrubbing harder than I needed to. The sound of his voice felt like nails scratching at my brain. Then he laughed. It wasn't a hearty laugh or even a sinister one. It was soft, breathy, and completely detached, like he was laughing at a joke no one else could hear. I clenched my teeth, willing my body to stay calm. "Don't react. Don't acknowledge him." "Do you think she sees you too?" he whispered suddenly, his voice louder now, directed toward me. I didn't answer. I didn't move. The bench creaked faintly as if he'd shifted his weight. My heart hammered in my chest. "She does, you know," he said, his voice almost playful. "She sees everything." I focused on the rhythm of my cleaning, scrub, rinse, repeat. The old man didn't speak again, but his quiet, raspy laughter continued as I finished the area. When I finally turned to leave, I kept my head low and my pace steady. The laughter faded as I walked away, but I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I moved to another section of the station, trying to push the old man's voice out of my head. I was shaken, but I couldn't stop now. There was no telling who or what I'd run into next. Near the wall by the abandoned ticket counter, I noticed someone else. This one wasn't hunched or shadowed. He stood tall, sharply dressed in a crisp suit, a leather briefcase in one hand. At first glance, he looked completely out of place in this decrepit station, like he'd stepped out of a corporate office and wandered here by mistake. He paced near the wall, checking his watch repeatedly, his expression a mix of impatience and unease. I slowed down, my pulse quickening. This must be the businessman. He noticed me immediately. "Excuse me," he said, his tone clipped but polite. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded cautiously. The rule was clear: answer briefly and truthfully. "Do you think the trains run faster if someone's waiting?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. The question caught me off guard, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I don't think so," I said carefully. He tilted his head, considering my answer. Interesting." He paused, tapping his fingers against the handle of his briefcase. "What about you?" he asked suddenly. "Do you ever wonder if the trains are late because they know you're watching?" I frowned, unsure how to respond. "I've never thought about it," I said honestly. The businessman's lips curled into a faint smile. "Good, it's better not to dwell on such things." He stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking softly against the tile. "Do you ever get the feeling," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "that someone is keeping score, watching to see if you follow the rules?" My throat felt dry. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely audible. The smile vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "You're doing well so far," he said, his tone almost approving. "But rules are easier to break when you think no one's watching." Before I could respond, he turned sharply and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. I stood there, frozen, until his figure disappeared into the shadows. The air felt heavier now, pressing down on me like the station itself was alive, breathing down my neck. Every rule I'd followed so far had kept me safe, but his words rattled me. Was someone, or something, watching to make sure I didn't break them? And what would happen if I did? By the time I finished scrubbing the second platform, my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold on to the mop. The weight of the station had pressed down on me for hours, and the eerie silence between encounters had started to feel suffocating. I told myself I was almost done, just a few more spots, and then I could leave. But something told me the worst part was still to come. I turned a corner, and then I heard it. The rhythmic banging of plastic against tile, sharp and jarring, more frantic than before. The street musician. I glanced down the platform, my heart sinking. He was still there, sitting on the cold tiles with his plastic buckets in front of him. But now, his beats were violent, the cracks in the plastic echoing like gunshots. Every hit seemed to strike right at the core of my nerves, jarring me with its unrelenting tempo. Tip me, he screamed, his voice warped with desperation. You can't ignore me, you can't escape me. I froze, my mind racing. I had nearly broken the rule once, almost offering him a coin in my panic, but I'd caught myself in time. This time, the pressure was unbearable. His eyes locked onto mine, burning with a crazed intensity. But I remembered the rule, and I kept my hands firmly at my sides. No, I muttered, my voice cracking. I'm not tipping you. He howled, shaking his head violently as his buckets cracked against the stone, sending a sharp sound ricocheting off the walls. I couldn't look away, couldn't move. I had to stay calm. I couldn't break the rule. Just as my knees began to buckle from the stress, the noise stopped. It was as if the world had gone silent again, except for the racing of my own heartbeat. I forced myself to take a breath and moved quickly down the platform, my footsteps loud against the concrete. I didn't dare look back. But as I reached the next set of stairs, I saw her. The woman in the black fur coat. She appeared as if she had materialized from the shadows, gliding toward me like a figure from a nightmare. The sunglasses hid her eyes, but her smile was too wide, too unnerving. "Excuse me," she said in that same smooth voice, but this time it had an edge, a sharpened menace beneath it. "I'm looking for an address. Do you know how to get to Chelsea Manor?" I recognized the address. It wasn't real. The words of the rule echoed in my mind, and I steadied myself. "No," I said, my voice tight, "but I can tell you how to get to Bethlem Royal. It's not far from here." Her smile didn't falter. "Bethlem Royal," she repeated slowly. "I see." And just like that, she turned and walked away without another word, vanishing into the shadows. I exhaled in relief, but before I could calm myself completely, I heard the rustling behind me. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, dragging closer. The bracelet seller. I hadn't seen him in what felt like ages, but here he was, stepping into view with that same strange grin plastered on his face. His backpack was heavier now, bulging as if it was filled with more than just bracelets. "You don't look like someone who appreciates the world's stories," he said with a wink, stepping closer until I could smell the faint scent of sweat and dust clinging to him. I barely managed to keep my voice steady as I mumbled, "I'm not interested." But he wouldn't take no for an answer. "Ah, but that's the thing. No one's ever interested. Not until they've made a mistake." His words sent a chill down my spine, and I wanted to back away, to run. But I couldn't break the rule. I had to engage. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped closer, so close now that I could feel his breath against my face. "The world is full of wrong turns, Susan. Choices that lead us down paths we can't return from. Wouldn't you agree?" I nodded, trying to force myself to sound casual. "Sure, I guess." His eyes bored into mine as he spoke, his words a low hum, pressing against my skull like a persistent ache. "Choices. That's all life is. A series of wrong turns, one after another." He tapped a bracelet in his hand, the beads clinking softly. "This one," he said, holding up a simple woven bracelet, "was given to me in a place where the sun never sets. And that man," he gestured vaguely, "he chose to walk that way. And now he's stuck, forever." I could feel the weight of his words crushing down on me, but I stayed silent, my mouth dry. The seconds felt like hours. Finally, he turned abruptly and walked away, muttering under his breath, "Wrong turns, Susan, you'll know them when you see them." I didn't wait to see where he went. I forced myself to keep walking, to keep cleaning, though my mind was racing. And that's when I saw him. The old man. He wasn't muttering anymore. He was shouting now, his voice rising to a frantic pitch, and his laugh. It wasn't the quiet chuckle from earlier. It was a loud, maniacal sound that seemed to echo through the station, making the walls shake. "She's always watching," he screamed, his voice cracking. "She's here. She's always here." I stumbled backward, almost tripping over a loose tile. The laughter filled my ears, vibrating in my skull. My hands were slick with sweat, my heart racing. I could feel the weight of his eyes on me, even though I didn't dare look at him. But the worst part was that I almost snapped. Almost screamed at him to shut up. But I didn't. I couldn't. I walked away, my breath ragged and shaky. And just as I turned the corner, I saw him again, the businessman. He stood in the middle of the platform, his briefcase at his side. His suit was immaculate, as always, but his expression was colder than before. "You've been doing well so far, Susan," he said in that icy tone. "But it's easy to break the rules when you think no one's watching." His words cut through me like a knife. My chest tightened, and I almost spoke out of turn, almost told him to leave me alone. But the rules stopped me just in time. "I haven't broken any rules," I managed to say, though I felt like I might choke on the words. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, like the smile of someone who had seen too much and expected too little. "Not yet, but we all have our breaking points, don't we, Susan?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The pressure, the suffocating silence, the constant watching, it was all becoming too much. I could feel it, the point where I might snap, the point where I might break. But somehow, I held on. For now. The station was unnervingly quiet now. The kind of silence that presses down on you, suffocating, as though the air itself has thickened into something tangible. I finished the last of my cleaning, scraping the corners of the platform with a shaking hand. The lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that danced along the walls. Everything about this place felt wrong, but I had one thing left to do. Leave. The faster, the better. I gathered my mop and cleaning supplies, and my heart nearly skipped a beat when I heard nothing but my own breathing in the emptiness. The distant hum of the city outside seemed so far removed from this place now. There was no sound, no movement, just an unnerving stillness that threatened to swallow me whole. I walked as quickly as I could toward the exit, my footsteps echoing off the tiles, too loud, too hollow. And then I saw it. There, taped to the door, was a handwritten note. "Don't look back." My stomach dropped. The words were scribbled hastily, as if someone had written them in a panic. A chill swept through me. The urge to glance behind me, just to make sure no one was standing there watching me, was almost overwhelming. I could already feel it. The sensation of being followed, the pressure that built behind me like an invisible force. I swallowed, my throat dry. But I knew the rule. I didn't look back. I forced myself to push through the door, each step heavier than the last. My skin prickled, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around, to look. But I obeyed. The cold night air hit me like a slap as I stepped outside. The streets of London were just as I remembered them, dark, quiet, but familiar. I wasn't sure if it was relief or dread flooding my chest, but I breathed in deeply, savoring the taste of freedom. I made my way down the street, my pace quickening as I reached the familiar hum of the city. I didn't look behind me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, but when I glanced over my shoulder there was nothing. I felt safe, but not really. I couldn't explain it. When I finally made it back to my flat, I collapsed onto the couch, exhausted but unable to fully unwind. It felt as though the entire night had followed me here. I couldn't shake the images of the strange people, the street musicians' unhinged screams, the woman in the fur coat's eerie smile, the businessman's cold words. I stared at the clock. The night had felt endless. The next morning, I was back at the station, cleaning as usual. I knew I had to face my coworkers. They'd see it in my eyes. Something had changed in me. When I told them what had happened, they listened quietly, their expressions unreadable. For a moment, I almost hoped they'd deny it, tell me it was all some elaborate joke or a misunderstanding. But they didn't. "You're lucky you followed the rules," one of them said finally, his voice low. He wouldn't meet my gaze. The others nodded in agreement, as if that was the end of it. They didn't ask me for details. They didn't need to. They already knew. They never talked about it again. And neither did I. But as I lay in bed that night, the faint memory of the drumming still echoed in my mind, like a phantom presence I couldn't shake. I had survived the night. I had obeyed the rules. But there was something deeper than that. Something I couldn't explain. Something that lingered at the edge of my thoughts, refusing to fade. I woke in the dead of night, drenched in cold sweat, the rhythmic sound of buckets echoing through my head. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But as I lay there, staring into the darkness, I couldn't help but wonder, had I really escaped? Or was I still part of their game? I couldn't know for sure. But one thing was certain, I'd never go back to Down Street Station.